My name is Maureen Conway. I'm the Executive Director of the Economic Opportunities Program, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's event, in which we'll be discussing microenterprise as a job creation strategy. At the Economic Opportunities Program, we are really focused on the challenges that low to moderate income Americans face today in trying to earn a livelihood in today's economy. We work with a variety of local initiatives and institutions that are developing new strategies that are supporting the economically vulnerable in trying to promote their economic success. And as part of this work, we've been hosting a series of conversations that bring together diverse perspectives from policy, academia, business, education, and other spheres to discuss the challenge that low-income Americans face today and to think about new ideas that can address these challenges and help move us forward. Today's conversation focuses on the potential of microenterprise to address the job deficit in today's economy and draws on research and policy analysis developed as part of the Big Ideas for Jobs series that is supported by the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the Kellogg Foundation. And we're particularly grateful to the Annie E. Casey Foundation for their support of today's event. And I want to acknowledge Bob Gilloth and Patrick Kane from the Annie Casey Foundation who are here with us today. And to start us off, I am delighted to introduce Don Graves, who has 3 jobs, so I'll try to get all 3 titles right. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Small Business, Community Development, and Housing with the U.S. Department of Treasury, and he's also the Executive Director for the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. And in his free time, he gets to go to Detroit, where he's leading the government's investment in Detroit and working with city, state, business, nonprofit, and community stakeholders. So he's a busy guy, and you have more information about him and all our speakers in your packet, so I won't belabor my introductions. I am delighted to welcome Don to the podium, and please join me in welcoming Don. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Maureen, and thank you, Aspen, for inviting me. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here to join this panel and talk about something that is critically important for the country. The President believes that we need to focus full force on ways that we can make sure that all people in our communities have the opportunity to succeed, particularly those who are the most vulnerable, low and very low income residents of our communities. One of the things that I do in my job, both at Treasury and at the White House, is try and find ways that we can support a whole range of folks as they create jobs, as they help to grow the economy, as they help to make this country more competitive. And the work that the Aspen Institute has done, Field has done at the Aspen Institute is so important because it's helping to show that there are mechanisms that we can support microenterprises as they grow. You know, as Connie says to me all the time, you'll hear from her in a little bit. 1 in 3 is the tagline that she talks about. So if we had if 1 in 3, and I'm going to mangle this, Connie, but 1 in 3, if 1 out of every 3 micro enterprises in this country employed 1 additional person, we'd be at full employment. So I think it goes to say that it's really important for us as a nation to, and particularly those of us who work on policy, to think about ways that we can support growth of microenterprises, because that will help us get to a place where we as a country are more competitive and we can get our communities more stable and growing. As you all know, the President has spent a lot of time focusing on ways to support small businesses. He's passed a lot of legislation with the help of Congress. He's implemented new programs. And it's because we recognize that micro businesses basically account for 26 million U.S. jobs. That's not a small figure. And with large employers in the recent years hiring less so than many of us would like, it's all the more important that the self-employed and independent work take a more leading role in our economy. So there's a range of things that the President and the administration have done to support small businesses and micro businesses in particular, both with direct support through loans and investments and through a range of programs across the administration, but also indirect ways that we support microenterprises through regulatory improvements, through supporting mechanisms like grant programs across the government that support local and regional efforts to grow microenterprises. In fact, some of the things that you may not have heard about include a one-stop shop. We've known all along, those of us who've worked with small businesses have known that it's very difficult if you are an entrepreneur who wants to find out what resources there are at the government. Well, you can go to one of 200-300 different websites and get that information, or you can call around and maybe you'll get the information that you're looking for. The president heard that loud and clear and said, we need a one-stop shop for businesses. For an entrepreneur who wants to get a certain piece of information or learn about the range of support mechanisms. That's why the president created business.usa.gov. It's that one-stop shop. It provides access to that information in a way that business owners can use it to grow their business rather than wasting their time trying to track down information going to thousands of different links on a website. Similarly, the president has sought to streamline regulations that are hampering small businesses. We know that this is an issue for businesses at the local level and at the state level. Well, it was also a problem at the federal level. So the president signed several took executive action to reduce the amount of regulatory burdens on small businesses and asked all of the agencies to look at those regulatory rules that were in place that were hampering businesses from being able to succeed. So the agencies went back, looked at all the rules on their books, and found in many cases that they could either waive or they could tweak their rules so as to make it easier for businesses to engage in the work that they need to do, creating products, providing services, and not having to get hampered in red tape. So that's just one of many different things that we've been doing to help small businesses. At Treasury, we've spent a lot of time thinking about access to credit. We know that access to credit is a huge issue for microenterprises, for small businesses in all, but micro businesses in particular. That's why the president signed into law the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010. There are a whole range of components of the program that SBA has implemented, that the USDA has implemented. At Treasury, we have three different pieces of that legislation. One was the Small Business Lending Fund. This is a program that invested $4 billion in community banks. These are the banks that do the lion's share or an outsized portion of the share of the lending to small and micro businesses. Because of that $4 billion investment in 332 institutions across the country, community banks and CDFI loan funds or community development loan funds, we are seeing positive returns for the taxpayer. So this is at no cost to the taxpayer. And we're also seeing that lending has increased by more than $10 billion. So you take that $4 billion investment. As a result, the institutions have loaned more than $10 million above and beyond the lending that they were doing beforehand. What that actually turns into is around 41,000 new loans to small businesses. It also means that of those loans, I think we're somewhere around 65 or 70% of those loans were below $100,000. So these are actually loans that are going to the smallest of the small businesses, not mid-sized businesses, but actually getting to the businesses that are going to be the job creators and are the job creators. We also invested through another program called the State Small Business Credit Initiative. $1.5 billion went to states to support their innovative lending and investment programs all across the country. That $1.5 billion we expect will lead to $15 billion worth of new lending across the country. To date, it's supported around 5,000 new loans, and 80% of those loans through the SSBCI program went to businesses with 0 to 10 employees. So again, these are affecting the smallest businesses in the country. The program supports a range of, this program supports a range of state programs. I think there are about 142 different programs across the country, but it's really the most innovative and the most successful programs that it's supporting. Capital access programs, collateral support programs, loan participation programs, range of microenterprise programs. In fact, as Maureen mentioned, I spend a lot of time in Detroit. Just 2 weeks ago, the state of Michigan, using this SSBCI funding, launched a new microenterprise program with Huntington Bank. It's a $25 million microenterprise program focused on Detroit. So we're excited that these funds are actually getting to support microenterprises. In addition to that, we have this great part of Treasury. I really think of it as the retail part of Treasury. It's the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, or CDFI fund. This program supports low and very low income communities all across the country. Many of you have probably heard of the New Markets Tax Credit Program and the work that it's done over the last decade and a half. $33 billion worth of tax credits going to the lowest income communities in the country. In addition to that, we're providing hundreds of millions of dollars of grants to local CDFIs that are actually the ones who are working closely with microenterprises. So I'm not going to spend more time touting all the things that we've done. No doubt many of you know these programs yourselves. I will say that what I'm most excited about is some of the things that we've been working on recently. So Startup America is something the President helped to launch a few years ago, which is mobilizing billions of dollars of business resources to help launch hundreds of thousands of startups all across the country. And now we know that there are local startups all across the local startup collaboratives that are part of the Startup America partnership all across the country. I think it was just about a year and a half ago, the President signed into law something that he had been promoting for a while, which is the Jobs Act, or Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. One provision of that, we think, is a game changer in the democratization of capital for small businesses. That's crowdfunding. Many of you know about crowdsourcing. Many of you have likely heard about crowdfunding. Well, just, 3 weeks ago, the SEC actually put out its proposed rules on crowdfunding. If you've not taken the time to look at the crowdfunding rules, I encourage you to do so. Give the SEC your comments. I think the comment period closes in the middle part of February. Crowdfunding has the ability to get support from a crowd, from friends, neighbors, folks in the community, to help microenterprises take their great idea and hire an additional person to get the type of investment that they, I think, had once believed was only eligible for folks who lived and worked in Wall Street or in Boston or Silicon Valley. Now we can go out to the heart of the country and find ways to help support small enterprises with folks who live in their community, folks who believe in those small businesses but prior to this didn't have a way of investing in those businesses. So all of that is to say that we're very focused on what we can do to support microenterprise in this country. We think it is critically important, as I said, to help grow more businesses, help to employ more people so we can get the country to a place where we're all realizing the dream that each of us has. So with that, I want to again thank Aspen for hosting this event. I think the panel is going to be really interesting, and I look forward to hearing from you and working with you and meeting you all at some point. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Don, so much. And I think I was right. He's a busy guy, right? So I really want to thank Don again for his leadership and his energy and all he's doing to really promote microenterprise and build the field and build opportunities for Americans to create jobs. So let's thank Don again for his remarks. And now it's my pleasure to quickly introduce our panel. We have a really terrific panel for you again. We do have materials for you. So So I'm just going to try to quickly help you match names and faces in case you don't know everybody. Next to me is my colleague Joyce Klein, who is our director of the field program within the Economic Opportunities Program here at the Aspen Institute, and she will be moderating our panel today. And to her right, your left, if I'm getting this correct, is Elaine Edgcomb, who was the leader of field for many years and is now our strategic advisor, and we're happy to have her back with us today. Next, we have Ida Rademacher. We're also happy to have her back with us here today. She is Chief Program Officer for Corporation for Economic Development. Next, Elizabeth Kregor, okay. Director, Institute for Justice, Clinic on Entrepreneurship, and Lecturer on Law at the University of Chicago. And next, we have Connie Evans, who is the President and CEO of the Association for Enterprise Opportunity. And last, but certainly not least, we have Christiana McFarland, Interim Director of City Solutions and Applied Research at the National League of Cities. So thank you all so much for being with us here today. And I'm going to turn it over to Joyce to get the conversation started.
Great, thank you, Maureen. And I'd like to welcome everyone again. As Maureen said, I work within the Economic Opportunities Program, and I run the field program, which focuses specifically on microenterprise development here in the United States. So I'm really excited to be here for our conversation today and to be speaking with our panelists who bring a really deep and rich set of information and experiences to the conversation that we're going to have today. I also want to acknowledge that we timed this really well because Saturday is November 30th is Small Business Saturday. So you can think less about Black Friday. You should go out and spend your money, but also remember that you should go spend your money at small businesses on Saturday as well. So our goal is really to touch on 3 issues today: why, what, and how. So the first thing we want to talk a little bit about is why. So if in the United States we're concerned about creating jobs, and particularly we're concerned about creating jobs for low-income individuals and communities that have the greatest challenges in connecting to our economy, why is it that we might want to focus on microenterprise development as a key source of those jobs? So that's the why. Second, we want to talk about what it is that we can do to better support microenterprise development. Maureen mentioned that we're building off of 3 papers that were authored as part of the Big Ideas for Jobs series that was created by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. What they really wanted to do is, as we looked at the job creation challenge facing our country, was to look at policy ideas that were both feasible and scalable. And so that's what we're about today. What are the feasible and scalable policy ideas that might be ways to support microenterprise development in our country? So that's the what. And finally, the how. So we also wanted to get into not only what were those policy ideas, but how can we really move forward in terms of advancing those policy ideas. Some of these policy ideas are not that new. They've been around for a while. But the question is, how do we get them in wider play and scale them up here in the United States? So those are the 3 things we want to talk about. It's a lot to cover. We have a big panel because we wanted to have the authors of the papers, but also folks who could engage in a conversation with us. So I'm going to just do something, as opposed to making a lot of opening remarks, I'm going to do 1 definition and a couple quick logistics, and then we're going to jump right into our conversation. So I thought it would be useful to start with a definition of microenterprise development for those of you who aren't that familiar with it. So, and I think this is a pretty widely accepted definition in the United States, but we define it as businesses with 5 or fewer employees, excuse me, including the owner, and typically businesses that require $50,000 or less in financing. So if you think about how we define small businesses in the US, and if you go look at the SBA website, you'll realize we define it in different ways depending on what sector you're in. But generally it encompasses businesses that may have as many as 500 or even 1,000 employees. And for many of them, we're talking a small business can involve a business that has $35 or $50 million in revenues. But what we're talking about for micro business in the US is really the smallest set of those businesses, 0 to 5 employees. For those of you who may be familiar with microenterprise in an emerging markets context, often what folks are targeting there are really very small informal businesses that may require just a few $100s in financing. And while some of those businesses, there are businesses like that in the US that we're focusing on here as well, we did want to paint the picture for you that we are talking about businesses that can employ several people and really be formal full-time businesses for folks. So in terms of logistics, our format's going to be that I'm first going to pose a set of questions to our panelists to try to get some key ideas out on the table. Because we have a big group, I'm asking them to be pretty crisp, so hopefully we'll keep the conversation rolling. And then what we want to do is leave some time to have questions from those of you who are in the audience. For those of you who are on social media, our Twitter handle is @AspenMicro, and we have a hashtag for this event, which is Discuss Micro Jobs. I know we have some folks joining us by live stream, and also C-SPAN's here, so if folks who are watching us virtually want to tweet questions, we're going to try to follow that, and maybe we'll be able to queue those up in the Q&A. I will ask those of you who are with us today in person, if feel free to tweet, but please turn your phones to silent. So with that, we're going to jump right into the conversation. I'm going to start with Elaine. So Elaine, you've been, and we at Field have been doing research on the microenterprise field for about 2 decades. And focusing specifically on the network of community-based organizations that work to support low and moderate income entrepreneurs in the United States. So can you start by painting a picture for us of what these micro businesses look like based on your research and what the organizations that work with them are like?
Sure, Joyce. Thanks for asking that question. I think the definition that Joyce put out right at the top here was a really helpful one to think about it quantitatively. But when you think about what these businesses really are, I like to think about them as the businesses that make our communities livable and in many ways delightful. That without those businesses, we don't have livable communities or delightful communities. They're street vendors and shopkeepers, they're tailors, they're bookkeepers, they're the people who clean our houses, they're the people who clean our offices, they're daycare providers, they're the people who make crafts and artisan products that we like to buy, they're the people who take food and transform it into wonderful specialty foods. There are restaurant owners. All of those kinds of people that make our communities livable and delightful are micro-entrepreneurs. And across the US, there's over 800 nonprofit institutions that are providing services to entrepreneurs like that to help them start and grow their businesses. And those institutions vary in form. Some of them do microenterprise development as the sole thing that they do. Others do that as part of a set of other services they offer. They're community development financial institutions, they're educational institutions, they're community-based organizations, and they all provide services that entrepreneurs need. About 45% of them provide loans and capital access, and the other 55% or so lead with training and technical assistance services for those entrepreneurs. And they will serve a wide variety of those entrepreneurs that I just described, but in particular they focus on those that are disadvantaged, that have fewer mechanisms for accessing capital or business services. And so they reach out to those who are largely women. I think the last US microenterprise census indicated that 58% were women. They're largely minority. They are low income. I think about 70% were low to moderate income, and over 45% of them were actually working poor, folks whose household incomes were at 150% or below of the federal poverty guidelines. So those are the kinds of people that we're talking about today and that these programs are concerned about.
Great, so thank you. So that's sort of the research picture of who folks are. So what I wanted to do now is turn to Beth. And Beth, you work in a law clinic that works with low-income entrepreneurs. So we're going to get to your policy recommendations in a second because you bump up against some policy issues all the time. But I want to just have you start by describing for us one of the entrepreneurs who you've worked with in your clinic and maybe give us a flavor of some of the challenges you've worked with them on. So.
Absolutely. As Joyce mentioned, I'm the director of a legal clinic that provides legal assistance and advocacy for low-income entrepreneurs. And as was mentioned, some of these big ideas are not new, and our big idea is as old as the country. It is that each American has the fundamental right to dream a big dream and start a small business. One of the many entrepreneurs I've met over the years I've been working in the IJ clinic is Manny Hernandez. And he is someone who worked in some of the best restaurants in town, but as the economy started to turn down, he lost his job. Instead of lamenting, he took it as an opportunity to start his own business, create his own job for himself and for more people. So in Chicago, unfortunately, it's illegal to sell food from a food cart, so unless you're selling ice cream. So the most affordable way for him to start a business, the most affordable way for him to test the market and get out into some of the local neighborhoods with his culinary creations was foreclosed to him. He did start a food truck called the Tamale Spaceship. And he and his co-founders loved the luchadores that they grew up with, the Mexican wrestlers. So they served excellent tamales wearing Mexican wrestling masks, which I think are probably very hot, but really fun. They certainly make the neighborhood delightful. And he went from unemployed to being an employer of 5. I guess that just tweaks him out of the definition of a microenterprise, because with himself there were 6. And he had created these jobs. But unfortunately, the city of Chicago says that a food truck cannot be within 200 feet of a restaurant. And you can't be downtown or in any of the neighborhoods where there's a lot of foot traffic, which is good for a food truck, if you're more than 200 feet from any restaurant. So this was a serious challenge and burden for the Tamale Spaceship and all of the other food trucks in the city. When efforts were made to explain to the city how important the opportunity to start a food truck was for these beginning entrepreneurs, the city did write some new laws, but unfortunately they actually tightened the screws on the food trucks. The fees for parking close to a restaurant went from $250 to $500 to $1,000 to $2,000, 4 times the fees for an actual health violation. So this anti-competitive law that was in place only to protect the restaurants ends up making life extremely difficult for the entrepreneurs like Manny, who are starting their baby businesses and hoping to grow those businesses into the next years or next decade's restaurants.
So great, that gives us a real flavor for what we're talking about. So I'm going to turn to Connie now, because one of the issues that comes up, I think, for those of folks like you who are the voice of microbusiness and microenterprise programs in the U.S., when you talk to policymakers, of this question of whether, if these are microbusiness, like how valid a strategy of this? How big is this as a sector in our country, and is it really worth focusing on these tiny businesses when one thinks about job creation? So, Connie, you just did some research which looked at the issue and how microbusinesses create to our overall economy. So, can you give us some top-level highlights from that work?
Yes, thank you, Joyce. And speaking of big, actually, the report is called Bigger Than You Think, the economic impact of microbusiness in the U.S. And that study, funded by the Kellogg Foundation, points to the enormous impact that is made by microbusinesses. First, 92% of all businesses in this country are micro. 98% of all African American owned businesses are micro. And nearly 96% of all Hispanic businesses in this country are micro. And so we're talking about the majority of businesses in this country. Overall, and in the aggregate, these businesses create or help to create more than 41 million jobs. Again, that's directly, indirectly, and the induced job effects from micro businesses. 41 million jobs, which is nearly 30% or 31% of all the job creation in this country. And so we think it's very important to bring the data that the contribution, the outsized contribution made by micro businesses really, as your example shows, can become an economic lifeline for individuals in their communities. For women, we found in the data that women who are using microbusiness as a strategy are able, on average, to generate between $8,000 and $13,000 more income than those who are not in a microbusiness. We found also that it has a particular satisfying and productive effect on wealth creation. For example, micro business owners are have 2.5 times more wealth than non-business owners. For a Latino man, the difference is 5 times, and for an African American woman, the difference in owning a business, a micro business in particular, is 10 times the wealth creation than otherwise. And so we think these, effects really do become game changers for individuals and communities who are underserved. We talk about underserved because of their lack of starting wealth. The products and services that are needed to fit their particular and unique set of circumstances and help their businesses to start and grow either are not available or they're just not accessible. And so we think there's a great opportunity looking at this data in the aggregate to really change policies, not only policies, but to change the idea and our imagination of what we think about when we think of businesses in the community, because they really are micro.
Great, thank you, Connie. And thank you for, I like the fact that you broadened to include the wealth question as well as the jobs question, because obviously in the short term, and what we're really focusing on today, our country has a jobs issue, but we also have a very important long-term issue with growing inequality in terms of wealth creation. So understanding the wealth effects of these businesses is important as well. So thank you for raising that. So Elaine, I wanted to come back to you now. Connie started to reference the role that, and you mentioned as well, the role that microenterprise development organizations play in supporting particularly the most disadvantaged and the folks who have the hardest time accessing resources. So, and some of your most recent research, and in fact the study that the Casey Foundation funded as part of the Big Ideas for Jobs series, looked specifically at the job creation effects of microenterprises. So give us some sense of what you learned through that research.
Sure. So what we did was we worked with 23 microenterprise development programs across the country, and together with them collected survey data on close to 1,200 entrepreneur clients of those programs who were randomly selected from all of the clients that they served in 2009. And we looked at their experience in 2010, and we collected the data in 2011. And what we learned was that these disadvantaged entrepreneurs were indeed able to create jobs not only for themselves, but for others in their communities. And we looked at an array of data points. So for example, we found that in under about 2 years, about a year and 7 months, the number of jobs supported by these entrepreneurs increased 104%. We found that the owners, 2/3 of them were working full-time at their businesses. The employees, a third of them were working full-time. The wages that they were being paid exceeded the federal minimum wage. For owners, it had exceeded the federal minimum wage by about 53%, and for workers, it exceeded it by 38%. We also found that for owners who were below the poverty line when they entered the program, 80% of them were above the poverty line when they were surveyed, due in part to the income that was generated from those enterprises. We even found that very poor people were able to create businesses that employed other people. 36% of the people who came into programs below the poverty line not only created a business for themselves, but generated employment for other people in their community. There were 1.4 jobs for other folks per business among the very low income folks in the study. The other thing we learned that it cost between $5,200 and $5,500 to support the creation of one of these jobs, which is a very reasonable amount of money. And we learned that for every dollar invested in the programs, $3 were generated in wages paid either to workers or the owners themselves, and that was within the space of about a year and a half. So if we project that out, we could see that that investment would multiply even much further. So those were the kinds of data we were able to find out from these quantitative surveys. We weren't able to peer inside the employee's household or look at how the employee considered the quality of the job, to what extent it provides a career ladder or opportunity for future development. But coming soon, we will be able to do that. Field at this moment is commencing a qualitative study. Staff will be interviewing a set of employees of business owners supported by Acción East in New York. And once those interviews are done, hopefully we'll be able to speak to just how these employees think about these jobs and what is the role that they play within their households. So the quantitative picture looks great, and we're really looking forward to the qualitative picture
We're
as
really
well.
excited about that
Yeah.
work. So hopefully that gives folks a picture of what we're talking about in terms of the jobs created by microenterprises. So we're going to turn now to the policy question, our second question of what. And I'm going to start with IDA. So the Big Ideas Project is, I guess, as I mentioned, is about advancing policy ideas that are both feasible and scalable, which is no small challenge in today's policy context. And what CFPD did with your paper is what you looked at in trying to keep that issue of feasible and scalable in mind was to sort of say, what are some existing systems out there, policy systems, policy mechanisms that we could leverage to better support entrepreneurs? And the one you focused on in your paper was the tax system. So talk with us a little bit about how you think the tax system could be changed or modified to better support these startup and small microenterprises.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to, and it's a great foundation of conversation to start sharing some of the things that we learned with this research. So, I think that why entrepreneurship, why self-employment and microbusiness for job creation has been well stated. I know SBA itself put out some research looking at 15 years of the trend of job creation, net new job creation, and found that 65 to 90% of net new job creation came from small businesses between 1995 and 2010. So thinking about that and thinking that most businesses start as sole proprietorships, they start as that zero and they grow, and some of them grow a lot and some of them grow not so much. But that at that point, when you're a sole proprietor, you are still using the individual tax code, right? So we're not in corporate taxes. We're talking about income being reported, and you'd put it just on your 1040 like you would wage income, and it's self-employment income. So just to size that market, there was, I think, 23 million people that used the Schedule C, which is the filing mechanism with the 1040 forms, or the Schedule C EZ, to file their business earnings. And of that, we think about 13 million of those were low-income folks. So when you think about tax time in the United States, it is probably the largest leverageable moment to connect with low-income entrepreneurs. And then just to put a little more context on that, the tax code is complex for all of us. It is incredibly complex and difficult to navigate when you're a very small business that didn't get into the job of running your own business so you could be excited about the tax code, right? You did it because you wanted to wear a Mexican mask, or you wanted to, see your dream fulfilled for yourself and your family. And so the counterintuitive side of that is that when you actually look at what happens at tax time for self-employed and sole proprietor businesses, there's not a lot of insistence. And in fact, the environment is somewhat punitive. The main oversight issues, the tax gap that happens at tax time is a lot about kind of small businesses that aren't filing, informal businesses that aren't filing. And so the kind of culture tends to be one of looking at the problems of compliance and enforcement, rather than trying to figure out if most businesses start as sole proprietorships, and if before they can even access credit, they need other kinds of assistance, what can we do at the very start to set them up for success, both in terms of the kind of financial capability they need to navigate the tax code, but also in terms of really understanding the other kinds of assistance that can set themselves up right from the very purpose of when they formalize their business. So having said all that, really quickly, I'd say that two things to keep in mind. There's currently no existing credits, refundable or otherwise, that exist in the individual income tax code that explicitly target low-income self-employed and micro-business owners in terms of any kind of incentive to them. The things that do exist, the fact that you can amortize your business startup costs, or that if you actually make enough to itemize your tax deductions and to kind of do a non-1040 type of thing, you could deduct half of your FICA, your Social Security and Medicaid payments. Those exist, but as we see with most tax incentives, it's really not helpful until you're pretty high up the income bracket. When you're a lower income person, if it's not a refundable credit, it's not particularly helpful. So we've talked about the disincentives, and I'd say that when you think about what opportunities there are, there's a couple of things. One of the first things that we talked about that is probably one of the biggest reaches, even though it's leveraging the tax system and it's leveraging this idea of refundable tax credit, would be a new entrepreneur tax credit. And we've put this idea out, and Freelancers Union has supported an idea like this as well. It's the idea that there would be some ideally refundable credit, either limited by the age of your business, so you can only claim it once or twice, or limiting the amount Nebraska has a model of this policy that we could build on. That would have the real opportunity to incentivize a lot of additional folks to do self-employment and to get over those hurdles. And I think the other thing is leveraging the current tax incentives, the refundable tax credits that do help a lot of small business owners. So the EITC, even though it's really focused on low-wage workers, the fact is that your self-employment income counts for that. And so really, I think in 2007, 6 million individuals who filed Schedule C actually reported some self-employment earnings, and a pretty large portion of that actually had most of their income from self-employment. There's a whole number of VITA program that comes out of the IRS that supports volunteer income tax assistance, that supports helping individuals, low-income individuals, navigate the tax system and file their taxes. And right now there's a pilot where a small number of those VITA sites are able to help low-income entrepreneurs with their Schedule C filing. But it's limited in both the sense that it's only a pilot, and also if you've got more than $5,000 worth of expenses, they can't assist you in that. So one thing would be to really look more closely at how VITA could be supportive. We're looking very closely at the pilot, CFED, National Community Tax Coalition, others looking at that. And so I think making sure that the credits that are refundable for low-income workers are more highly leveraged and used is the other opportunity. We can talk about other things later.
That's great. But that issue of tax time, I think, is really important. And it's important from the growth question, because what a lot of entrepreneurs will do is they would, when they start filing their taxes, if they start, is they'll look to minimize their income so they can minimize their taxes, but not realizing that when they want to go borrow money later, they're not showing a lot of revenue that a lender would want to lend against. So
they're not building a credit
creating
history.
some reason way to help folks be able to build towards that ability to grow into the tax system could be really important. So that was one idea that you surfaced. You've actually done some more work looking at another system, which is looking at the workforce system and how we might think about microenterprise in the context of the workforce system. So could you give
this
us
is
some
exciting
highlights
research
there?
that hasn't been published yet. The first New Ideas for Job Creation report that was published by the Casey Foundation by Bill Schrecky, who was the author, is up online. The new one will be coming out in January. And we actually looked at 3 systems. We looked closer at the tax code, we looked at the community college system, we looked at the workforce system. Within workforce, we talked to a lot of experts, and we just really, again, thinking about how do you leverage the systems that already exist. Workforce is the way. We're looking at trying to up employment. But one of the big things we found was that the way that the Workforce Investment Act, which is the primary funding vehicle for job training, the performance measures are pretty specific, right? They measure if you get employed, how long you are employed for, and how much you make. And those are the major things. If you're actually trying to assist somebody with business startup, with entrepreneurship, none of the ways that you would categorize if that person is successfully employed match up against the performance metrics that you rely on to get your funding year in and year out. So one of the first things to be done would be for the Department of Labor to figure out and actually support some alternative measures that count within the workforce investment system. Because there's actual guidance out there to support referring people to self-employment. If that's a self-identified idea and if their qualifications are there, there's a lot of guidance from the Department of Labor over the years that actually would say that you should refer people, but it's just really disincentivized in terms of the performance metrics. So that's, I think, the first most important thing. There's also the Self-Employment Assistance Program, which is a way that if you're receiving unemployment insurance, that rather than having to always be looking for that job as the way to count toward it, if your state has authorized through a legislative process the Self-Employment Assistance Program, you can be working on starting your business and still be receiving your unemployment insurance. That has such relevance right now, but the complexity and the red tape around actually letting a state be allowed to do that or letting people draw down those funds is complicated. So I think there's a lot more work to be done there. But again, it's entirely possible, and it's outside of what happens inside the Beltway in terms of making next steps happen.
Great. And I should note, Elaine, that in Field's paper, we also surfaced the Self-Employment Assistance Program as another one. So definitely that's a piece. Elaine, I wanted you to speak to 2 policy ideas that you raised in your paper, and these get more to the state level and the local level, so we're sort of moving down that spectrum. The first is the Community Development Block Grant Program. Is one of the ideas, and how that can be used and is being used, but possibly could be expanded to support microenterprise development. And the second is our capital access program. So could you speak to both of those?
Sure.
Okay.
So Community Development Block Grant funding is available to municipalities and to states to pass on to municipalities, and can be used for a broad variety of purposes. The real value of CDBG funds is their flexibility. They can be used to support a variety of tools and mechanisms to support economic development. And about 26 states have already decided to use some of their CDBG funding for microenterprise. But overall, I think maybe about only 9% of all the funds available for economic development are being applied to microenterprise. Under 1% of all CDBG funds that are available are being applied to microenterprise development. So there's really an opportunity to use those funds to support micro, which has been demonstrated in a few places, but a lot of states haven't taken advantage of doing that. And as I said, the idea here is that those funds can be used by states and localities in a very flexible way. So they can be used to support training dollars or technical assistance dollars to deliver services directly to entrepreneurs. They can be applied to loan funds so that more lending can be done to business owners. They can actually support the operating expenses of the programs themselves, which is often the hardest money to fund and come by, so that if a state or city is interested in leveraging the power of microenterprise for job creation, they can use that instrument very flexibly to fill in gaps within their local ecosystem in terms of what local programs need. And it's really worth thinking about how that's possible to do. And I just put that out there, think about how some of those resources can be shifted to support more of this job creation at the micro level. Capital access programs are programs that enable lenders to mitigate the risk of loans that they make to small businesses. What happens is a state's capital access program creates a reserve fund to which the state, the lender, and the borrower each contribute a portion of the reserve that's required against the specific loan. And then those monies are held in a reserve account, and if there is a default, those monies can be drawn upon to replace those lost funds. So what's the value here for a micro program? Well, microenterprise programs, first of all, lend to entrepreneurs who would not be lent to by the formal financial system. And so they expand much more broadly into the market where there's some risk. Right now, Colorado, North Carolina, Georgia, and California, I think, are the only states that use their capital access funds for microenterprise. There are 26 or 27 states that have these programs, but they've confined them mostly to the formal financial institution, to banks that are lending to small businesses. The 4 states that I mentioned have opened it up to microlenders, which really provides this powerful tool. In the state of California, it has meant Opportunity Fund in the Bay Area, Valley Economic Development Corporation in Los Angeles, Accion in San Diego, and a number of lenders in between have all had access to these funds under the Capital Access Program. And in 2011, I think 40,000 microloans were able to be made across the whole system because of allowing that access to that program. And the losses have been very limited. They've been very modest. I think in that year it was under 10%. So by diversifying the risk across all three parties, and by allowing lenders to expand their capacity to lend, it could be a really powerful tool.
Great. And there is some opportunity there because one of the programs that Don mentioned, the State Small Business Credit Initiative, actually got money into state capital access programs. So finding a way to open that to microenterprise could be really useful. Okay, so we've got one more set of policy ideas to tee up, and then we're going to bring in, particularly Connie and Christy, you've had a lot of experience with various of these policy ideas, working with them on the ground. So Beth, I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit about, you focus specifically on this issue of local licensing and how that affects microenterprises, and tell us a little bit about the barriers you see and some recommendations that you made in your paper about how to deal with them.
Certainly. So state and local governments far too often get in the way of these micro businesses and in the way of job creation, rather than clearing a path for these entrepreneurs to be creative and do brand new things. The local licensing requirements at the state and city level create these small boxes that micro entrepreneurs often have to fit into And they create all sorts of barriers for people. So 4 examples of the problems created by these kinds of licensing requirements are listed in my paper, and they include unnecessary training requirements. So in Illinois, for example, a nail technician has to go to school for hours and even take continuing legal education requirements afterward. Braiders all over the country are required to go to hundreds of hours of schooling to learn all about hairstyling and hair coloring and curling, things that they don't ever use. Another problem are unnecessary facilities requirements. So these laws, which are written to codify a very specific notion of what a business should be like, and importantly, these laws, which are heavily influenced by the businesses already in existence and kind of make permanent the business model of the businesses that are in existence who don't want the competition. So these laws require certain kinds of facilities, which are a waste of money. When we want these entrepreneurs to spend their money on new staff, we're asking them to spend money on facilities. Classic example, funeral homes or anyone involved in the funeral business around the country might be required to have a full funeral home with embalming rooms and everything. We represented at the Institute for Justice some monks in a monastery who simply wanted to build wooden caskets but weren't allowed to because they didn't have a full-on funeral home with a licensed funeral director. Thirdly, these laws create these very narrow categories that people have to fit into. Uber is a fantastic example of a brand new business that's using technology to improve transportation, but it's running into these problems in every city it enters because there are very rigid definitions of what a business could be. What is a taxi cab business? What is a livery or black car business? Uber's brand new idea blurs the lines between those categories, and therefore some cities prohibit Uber from operating altogether, which is a great loss to those cities and a great demonstration of the influence of the incumbent businesses on these laws. When Uber comes in and challenges the laws that define what a taxi cab is and what a black car is, it's the taxi cab companies and the livery companies who have long held sway in those city councils who fight Uber back and make it impossible for Uber to bring something new to the city's customers. And that brings me to the last category of unnecessary, inappropriate, and really damaging licensing regulations, which are just purely anti-competitive. Any kind of cap on the number of businesses that are allowed, a cap on the number of taxi cabs, or a requirement, like I mentioned, for food trucks that they be far away from their competitors, is simply preventing entrepreneurs from doing what entrepreneurs do best, which is innovating, bringing new ideas into the economy to challenge the folks who are already out there and to bring new and exciting services to the consumers, but also new and exciting jobs for their neighbors.
So thank you, Beth. One of the things you point out, which we didn't get to in sort of the macro question, is the issue and that's worth recognizing, which is the whole issue of independent work and self-employment is what we see as a growing labor market trend. And so that's another reason to think about these policies. Now, there are positives as well as negatives of the fact that that's a growing trend, and we could do a whole forum on that, and maybe we will someday. But it's worth thinking that to some extent it's going to be a labor market trend that's going to be with us, so figuring out how to respond to that. Okay, so let's get into the really tricky question, which is how do we move these ideas forward? And so I've got my two commenters on the end. Thank you for being patient, because you've been listening to a lot of people, but we're gonna cue you up now. So, Christy, I'm gonna start with you. You've been working on a bunch of these issues at the National League of Cities, the local ones, and I wanted to start by asking you sort of a big picture question, which is, if you think about what's going on in cities right now, where on their list is the issue of job creation as an important issue? And when they think about job creation, do they think about these micro businesses?
I think that's a great question, and the answer is yes. Job creation is still right up there. We've done a number of different types of surveys and interviews with city officials from across the country. Thinking about things like service provision, finances, and job creation. Those are sort of the big three that we're seeing for sure. I think traditionally when we're thinking about job creation, economic development, and cities in terms of the policies that they employ to get there, we typically think about economic attraction, which is, how do cities really attract sort of these bigger businesses and companies to their communities? We know, again, through our survey work that that's still an important component of a lot of the economic development strategies that cities are employing. They're thinking about economic attraction in different ways, which, again, could be a whole separate forum, but I think in more strategic ways. But they're also looking towards a much more balanced economic development approach, which includes small business and microenterprise development. We know that looking to 2013 and 2014, cities across the country really are looking to up the amount of investment that they're making in those types of programs in their community. And specifically, I think it's interesting when we think about small business development, microenterprise development, by and large, it's just regular business development. How do you make your community more business friendly? In the sense that we're not looking at tax policies specifically. We're not looking at, again, how to attract larger businesses, but really how do you make the local government itself more friendly to and compatible with the businesses that potentially can be in the community, growing from within the community, and really just want to be in the community and potentially, again, I think microenterprise we've talked about as being those types of businesses that really do create the quality of life in the community, but also there are other enterprises that have different growth aspirations to looking towards, this can be the next larger business in your community. So there are lots of reasons why local governments certainly are looking to a more balanced economic development approach. And when they're thinking about what small business development means, what microenterprise development means for their community, it really is, how do you increase communication with these businesses, and particularly when we're thinking about microenterprises that may be in lower income neighborhoods, or may potentially, we're thinking about immigrant communities as well. How do you create services, create those services, and then promote and communicate those services in a way that is linguistically and culturally relevant to these communities as well?
So one of the issues you've been working on at National League of Cities is the issue that Beth raises, which is the issue of how do business licensing regulations get in the way, and how do they constrain microenterprises? And particularly, you've been dealing with the issue of food trucks, which she raised. So can you talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing, and maybe give us some ideas of places, cities where there's a lot of really interesting work going on and you're making some progress, and maybe what some of the challenges have been as you've tried to move that agenda?
Sure. I think, Beth, you raise a lot of interesting points, and I would agree with most of those. And I think when we're thinking about licenses, particularly at the city levels and permits, there's always a reason why a particular permit or a license was there to begin with, right? But over time, and I think as we've said, it's unless you actually take an inventory, take stock, think about why those licenses and permits are there to begin with, it just kind of keeps getting layered on until the actual impact is it's stymieing job creation and business development in the community. And there are lots of places, obviously, that have been experiencing growth in food trucks more recently. So it's an emerging industry that really is growing up more quickly than city regulations and licenses and permits can keep up with. But it's also an area of the economy that many cities see as holding a lot of promise for entrepreneurship, particularly for microenterprises. So what we're seeing at the city level is that communities are dealing with issues related to public health, public safety, all these other critical factors. How do they regulate public space? But really looking at licensing and permitting as sort of the key impediment to helping support these businesses. So how do cities take an inventory, again, of what licenses and permits they have in place? What are the impacts of those? And what we've found by and large is that even those cities that have been proactive in terms of taking inventory of what those licenses and permits are, there's still about 3 to 5 permits that are required, and this is on sort of the positive scale. 3 to 5 permits, 3 to 5 departments that need to be visited by the business themselves. Although some of that may not necessarily be able to be decreased beyond that 3 to 5 permits or 3 to 5 departments that need to be visited, we know that cities are also looking at costs of the permits as well. And you take a place like Austin, for example, which probably is well known to many as supporting their food truck industry. They have a very comprehensive website, for example, that really lists out and specifies all of the information that anyone who's interested in starting a food truck really needs to know. All printable forms, easy access to information, and again, they've found that that's helped. In Cincinnati, for example, obviously public health is always going to be the key when it comes to food trucks in terms of what regulations and permits are going to be most concerned with. So they've created a one-stop shop for food trucks through their public health department. So these are various ways that cities really are looking to supporting the food trucks in their community.
Great. Sound good, Beth?
Some.
We're making some progress. Okay, I'm actually going to jump to Connie now, then I'm going to come back and talk about CDBG, hopefully, with Christy. But Connie, so AEO focuses a lot at the national level, and one of the things that you've worked on in the past is the issue of the Workforce Investment Act and trying to deal with the issue that IDA surfaced. So talk to us a little bit about what you did and how that went and what you see as the continuing issues there.
Certainly. I think part of what we've tried to do, working with our state associations across the country, is to really get the state level workforce investment boards to understand the value of microbusiness and its role in job creation. As you've already heard, the barriers are in the actual policy in terms of how organizations are allowed to certify a placement, what they call a placement, so that they can be funded. And so we have actually run, some of our members have created these pilot sites throughout the country that use workforce investment funds. And so we've actually been able to give a formula and provide alternatives on what could be used. I think the problem has come that Department of Labor oftentimes just doesn't recognize entrepreneurship as job creation. Business development, they have actually said to me, that's not the same as creating a job when you create a business. And so we have a real disconnect in terms of what job creation really is, how it's formulated, and that these businesses, when you start a business, yes, you have created a job. And so we're continuing to work to try to get changes, written changes, if we ever get the WIA reauthorized, because it still hasn't been. We have legislators who are ready to add new language toward that bill, and so that it could change automatically in the regulations. In 2010, we were instrumental in getting the administrator for the entrepreneurship training component at Department of Labor to issue a guidance letter to all the state organizations, all the workforce investment boards around the country, actually telling them in writing that it was okay to use entrepreneurship training, that they actually should encourage the WIBs at the local level to do so. And that still didn't happen. We believe that not only will we just need to mobilize more individuals, more institutions, just mobilize in terms of making a stronger case to make this change happen. And we probably need to necessarily get the regulation change. We think there are all kinds of opportunities through pilots to keep doing it, but if we want scalable, permanent change, we really have to focus on the federal legislation and urge reauthorization and passage of some of the amendments that have been actually authored and presented for this bill.
So we're getting a little bit caught up in this problem we have in Washington, which is that
Yeah.
not much is moving. Although you're starting to generate some energy, and you've demonstrated some.
We've
some
had
things that
energy, we've had new side-ons from legislators, participate in and come on board. So it's gaining interest, but still, we have the other kind of broader issue on the Hill in terms of actually getting that reauthorization. But it is gaining more acceptance. I think there's more work actually to do. I think that legislation will happen before we get Labor Department to address 21st century kinds of rules that really support, what labor looks like now. We don't have necessarily the world, we need. We don't have the rules and the laws to support, protect, or even count jobs in this country, because some of the work created by micro business owners isn't even counted as a job. So there's a whole trajectory of activity that needs to take place in terms of convincing Department of Labor that it needs to modernize and create more rational frameworks for today's 21st century worker, including those who are self-employed and owners of businesses.
Great. So thank you. So I'm going to go back to the state and local now, a little more state and local, although we talk about CDBG, which of course is a federally authorized and funded program, but really the decisions and the choices about how to allocate that money happen at the state and local level. So Christy, this is CDBG is a program that's near and dear to the hearts of local elected officials. So can you talk a little bit about what you see as the opportunities and maybe the issues there in terms of mobilizing more of Elaine talked about how it's a relatively small amount of those resources that go to microenterprise development. So could you talk a little bit about what some opportunities and challenges might be in terms of increasing that percentage?
Yeah, sure.
Right.
So I mean, we know with the downturn, cities really were being able to justify the use of CDBG funding for job creation, economic development purposes, particularly through supporting small businesses in struggling neighborhoods, and that obviously gets to a heart of the reason why we have CDBG in this country. Particularly, I think as Elaine mentioned, seed funding to CDFIs, loans directly to low-income business owners, facade improvements, really helping to again increase the quality of life in communities and supporting small businesses. And again, a lot of times, again, microenterprise, to the extent that it's a direct goal for the local government within their economic development. CDBG has been an excellent tool. So, thinking about challenges, there's always a threat to CDBG funding to local communities. This is particularly in the environment of increasing the amount of competitive grants to cities versus these flexible funding through formula like CDBG. So all cities above 50,000 in population receive CDBG funding regardless of need. And I think that in and of itself is sort of puts a challenge on local governments to really make the case for why CDBG funding is so critical to their communities. So although this flexibility is fantastic, and getting the funding directly to local communities is really what we want at the National League of Cities, of course, and communities across the country are looking for, that flexibility in and of itself also creates challenges for thinking about CDBG funding going forward, because there's a lot of, in terms of thinking about the types of programs, they're extremely broad. Again, ranging from economic development to neighborhood development, various types of programs that are allowable under the program, make it difficult to collect the data that's necessary to measure the performance and the impact of the funding and the programs in the community. So again, I think that gets at a particular challenge for justifying the continuation of CDBG funding to local communities. On the flip side of that, I think there are ways that cities can think about CDBG funding and being able to measure the performance and impact of those funds. And I think that's going to be sort of a critical component going forward. And this links directly to a program through the Aspen Institute, the Micro Tracker. Just one example is the city of Seattle is partnering with state partners and community-based organizations to to offer microenterprise training, specifically to immigrant microenterprises in the community. They've had a lot of success through their 6-week business development programs and trainings. And what they're finding is that these programs actually are having success. They are making an impact. The survival rate of the businesses that go through this program are much higher than the national average. And the only way that they're able to actually justify that and understand that is through the use of the specific program that they're partnering with the Aspen Institute to implement. That allows them to collect the data and the performance and have that contact with the microenterprises to be able to assess the impact that the program and the funding itself is making in the community.
And part of that's understanding what it costs to create those jobs, since that's a clear guideline within CDBG, one of the ways they get measured on their
Absolutely,
on
their and that program in Seattle, it was started in 2010 with a one-time $150,000 program through CDBG, and then continuing $75,000 in 2011 and 2012.
Mm-hmm. And Connie, you mentioned that Connie used to run a microenterprise program in Chicago, that you got 20 years of CDBG funding that was really a core of, excuse me, what supported your work.
It was very important, and again, we weren't the only organization to have it, but it really did go to support micro business development, and the organization kept it for its 20 years in existence.
Mm-hmm. So the importance of that flexibility, as Elaine mentioned, and really something you can rely on at the local level if you can make that case. So Connie, I wanted to come back to you and talk a little bit about, AEO does a lot of advocacy at the federal level. You also support these state microenterprise associations. And just thinking more broadly, and when you think about trying to leverage these different policy systems and policy ideas, how much of the problem is the specifics around the policy, and how much of the problem is just this greater lack of understanding and lack of really thinking about what the role of microbusiness is? And
it's an excellent question. I really think it's the latter. It's the lack of understanding. It really is the reason we've invested so much time and talent and resources into the research. The research that Aspen does is important because it digs into what the organizations are doing. But what we need to understand on a larger scale, again, since 92% of these businesses are micro in the country, we just need to increase the understanding of micro business. And so what we've found talking to states in particular is that once they understand these businesses and who you're talking about, and they recognize that, oh, my brother has a micro business. They never thought of that before. They begin to pay attention. They begin to understand that one size does not fit all, because they believe right now that they really are, as you talked about, they really are providing policies and programs to support small business. The problem is they don't recognize the nuance across the small businesses. And so there are many policies, as we've heard, that really interfere and are barriers to micro businesses because of their particular size. We found, for example, in Oregon, when we are working with our state micro business association and the governor's, the first lady of Oregon has a program where she's actually incorporated micro business as part of their prosperity program. It is a program focused on poverty alleviation only because of the understanding that she gained by actually looking at Kiva. And so once government or an individual in government develops a better understanding, once they have data, we found that there is a more willingness to actually start working and thinking about the types of programs that can help. We see in Chicago, for example, that there is a city program that has begun to put more emphasis on micro business and trying to expand micro business and micro lending. We've been asked by other cities to come and talk about and help them understand new ways of thinking about what they could do around micro business. So we think just having the understanding, one of my favorite mayors in the country was, I use his quote all the time, I won't say which one it is, but you may recognize this, it's not local. He says, "In God we trust." everybody else bring data. And so I think it's the case. We have to continuously bring the data so that we get a better understanding and the characteristics of these businesses. In the report I mentioned earlier, Bigger Than You Think, we've actually been able to create a typology that describes 5 different types of business owners of micro business. And we think based on their type of self-employment, their characteristics of income and revenues and other, we're beginning to understand a lot more about these businesses and their unique challenges and needs and what it will take for them to succeed. We also note that even the Secretary of the Treasury here has talked about and has said 8,000 bank loans are declined every day in this country to small business owners. And so if we want to change that, we really do have to look at capital access programs and the kinds of challenges to use those programs, whether they're banks or CDFIs. There are just capacity issues, a number of issues that are preventing these things from being useful. But we have to create better understanding across the board of the businesses and the hurdles related to them being able to be successful.
Great, thank you. Do you mind if I open up for questions? No, I was going to take up one more question to Ida, but we had a great conversation. So I want to take a bit of time to open up for, see if we have questions in the room, and if not, I'll come back and ask my question. So if folks have a question, if you could raise your hand, we will bring you a microphone, and we would ask that you identify yourself and your organization, and also, since we just have a few minutes for questions, if you can be brief and with your comment or your question. Do we have anyone? Yes, great. Just hang on a sec, Laura. We'll bring you a mic so that, great.
You talked about CDFIs and other institutions making loans to microenterprises. Are traditional banks doing it? And if not, why not?
Connie, you want to take that
Well,
one?
again, I just said 8,000 loans are declined a day. We think the real reason is the high cost of lending. Whether it's a bank or the CDFIs, their costs are unnecessarily too high. And so a lot of activity is going toward bringing down those costs, whether it's using technology, looking at different kinds of underwriting that bypasses FICO scores and brings in more using social media and social demographic data. Just a lot of things around big data and technology that can really begin to change the business model and the underwriting model used by banks and CDFIs to lower the costs. Most banks will not make a loan nowadays under $250,000. And so one of the things that AEO is doing is we've formed a micro capital task force actually out of the work and a forum that Don Graves and the Secretary have created. They created that forum bringing in fintech companies, financial and technology companies, and AEO is moving with that and creating a micro capital task force that looks at policy changes that are needed and regulatory changes that could be implemented to create a real financial market for sub $250,000 loans.
Okay. Elaine, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. A number of years ago, we at the Aspen Institute did a study trying to understand the market for microloans, and at that point, we found banks were going downstream, reaching smaller and smaller business owners all the time. This was pre-2008, of course, right? And they were using tools of the credit card and enhancements to credit scoring to do that. Then 2008 happened, and all of a sudden, aware of the risks, banks pulled way back up market. So what's changed a lot in the last 5 years is that banks have pulled out of a market they were entering at one point. And part of that's because they must be more conservative in the underwriting that they're doing, leaving that market open and available and underserved. And so that's where microlenders come into play. So the other thing, and just to follow on Connie's comment, the average loan of a microloan that we track within microenterprise programs across the country last year was about $15,000. So you compare that to a minimum loan that a bank might be willing to look at, that's many times the multiple of that. So how do we get those $7,000, $15,000, $10,000 loans out there easily to enhance business growth?
And I guess the other thing I would mention is that Connie talked about the 8,000 folks who get turned down every day.
Every day.
Every day. There's also, we know many people who never walk into a bank
Right.
in the first place because they know they don't have established credit or their credit's poor, or they know that they're not going to get a bank loan. So there's also the question of who serves that market, which is where the microenterprise and other organizations are looking to move but aren't banks. So do we have other questions? We got one here.
Hi
Ethan,
there.
if you could tell us who you are and your organization, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Phil Applebaum, and I work for the Institute for Justice with Beth. So we've been talking a lot about different sort of organizations and programs through the government and just through different things that would try to help micro enterprises grow. Has there been any work to try to organize wealthy individuals who would rather invest on their own? I mean, a $15,000 loan probably is much more possible for a millionaire maybe than for the banks. So has there been any sort of organization to try to get individual investors that are maybe big in the business already to invest in micro enterprises instead?
Connie, you want to take that? And then, go ahead, and then Elaine. Go ahead.
Quickly,
Oh,
there
Elaine.
are a number of programs. You heard Don talk about crowdfunding. So there's Kiva and some other programs like that. And then you have someone like Calvert Foundation that has notes that any individual, I think there's a limit to them, but individuals can invest at Calvert Foundation, for example, and those funds would go to a CDFI, be invested in a CDFI. And so Trillium, Calvert Foundation, some other entities like that. So those are the two kinds of examples. One is an individual organization that has a strategy such as Kiva, where they're doing that, and then the other is an investor funder type of strategy that tries to mobilize those funds.
And I think one thing I'd add on we didn't really talk about here, there is one kind of asset building program in the country there's one that's a federally funded Assets for Independence, and one of the things you can do match savings for is business startup. And then without that federal funding, you need to raise additional match to that. A lot of the IDA programs around the country do raise dollars from individuals to help match those savings.
And there are also groups, less institutionalized groups of angel investors who do look at a wide range of applicants. And I've even heard that there are rich folks who just hang out on Kickstarter and make generous anonymous donations to startups.
Right, and so I do think the crowdfunding regulations are going to be interesting and important. One of the questions we have is which entrepreneurs are going to get funded. So there may need to be mechanisms that are built to really allow some of the lower income entrepreneurs to be able to take advantage of that. But there's certainly, I think, an opportunity
And if
there.
you care about this issue, you really should weigh in on the regs, because it could really go against what we've been trying to work for.
Was there a question in that? Yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Teresa Dansudankwa, and my question is, what efforts are there that either exist or should be made to include the disability community and those with disabilities into the microenterprise development, as well as entrepreneurial skills and other access that may not be given directly to them or is more accessible for them? So if anyone, I don't know which one would be more
It's a great question because it's one of the target populations of the field. Elaine, do you want to talk a little bit about that, and then maybe some others?
I think historically about 5% of micro entrepreneurs supported by programs are people with disabilities. At least I've seen that across the years in different data sets that we've had. There is an organization called the Abilities Fund that has worked closely with microenterprise programs in different locations around the U.S. to try to help those programs understand what barriers they may be unintentionally putting in the way of working with people with disabilities and helping them revisit their policies, procedures, accessibility standards, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that different programs across the U.S. have been more sensitive to that than others, but there are models and mechanisms to make that happen. And it's certainly a target population that the field has been interested in. And Connie, I know over the years, at least in the past, AEO did education around how to open the doors and reduce barriers to people with disabilities in different ways through a variety of technical assistance offerings. So there has been some efforts. There probably could be many more initiatives of that type. But I think the field has understood that that's an important constituency.
I would just agree that there's a huge opportunity for more. I think one issue that we face is a lack of awareness of the programs. AEO, along with Citi, gave an award at our last conference this year, 2013, to a hearing impaired organization, a business that's a hearing impaired organization training entrepreneurs. And so I think trying to get more recognition and opportunities to increase replications of working models is huge. And one of the things that we're trying to do is help promote that particular model, but raise the visibility of these programs overall.
Great. So thank you. So we are at 1:30, so I'm going to draw us to a close. I want to thank my panelists here today. Thanks all of you for being here and for your contributions today, and for, most importantly, for the work that provides the basis for your ability to comment today. I want to thank Don Graves again for being with us and setting the stage so nicely. Thank the Annie E. Casey Foundation for their support for this event and the Big Ideas for Jobs series. I want to note a couple things. One is that the papers, and not just the microenterprise ones, but there is a website for Big Ideas for Jobs. It's bigideasforjobs.org. And you can find all of the papers there. We are going to do a second event here at Aspen, focusing on a couple other papers for the series. They're going to focus specifically on the opportunities that and policies that could support the work that social enterprises do, that anchor institutions like hospitals and educational institutions and others can do to create jobs, again, specifically focused on individuals and communities that have the largest challenges in attaching to our economy. So we don't have a date for that yet, but we're going to set it. We're working on it. And so we'll send invitations out to all of you again since you've been with us today. So look for that in the next couple of weeks. So thank you again for joining us today. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and shop small business on Saturday. Thanks, folks.